Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan Collins, for being here tonight. Can you hear us? We can't hear you, unfortunately.
You have to put on your mic.
Perhaps you have to put on your microphone. Unmute yourself, sir. Yes, there you are.
Perfect. Are you there?
No.
Let's just test it. It's fine. It's live, so that is fine. Can you say something? Oh, that's unfortunate. You actually had to, I'm going to explain to the viewers here in the Netherlands, Mr. Collins, that Ryan Collins, that you had to speak to a group of central bankers. So that's why you were a bit later, so we couldn't test your Zoom presence. Let's see if you are already, if we can already get your sound.
Hello? Hello?
Yes,
there
perfect. So
Okay.
hi again. So,
Hi.
ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the second interview, and that is with Josh Ryan Collins, as I already mentioned. And the floor is yours, David.
Thank you, Natasha. So now let's start for real. Mr. Ryan Collins, thank you for being here tonight with us. Professor Collins, when my father was young, he was about my age, he bought a house for about 200,000 guilders, or you could say 85,000 euros. And he paid off his mortgage in less than 10 years. Today, such a scenario is impossible for me and a lot of people from my generation, as our columnist Kees Buitendijk also mentioned. Here in Amsterdam, especially, young people need the financial help of their rich parents to buy a home. Why have housing prices risen so fast over the last few decades?
Thanks. Yes, it's a very good question. There are a number of reasons behind it, and the one you hear most commonly is that it's to do with insufficient supply of new housing. So either the private sector or the government's not building enough homes. Now, this may be the case in certain regions, certain countries at certain times. And it's certainly, I think, the case that there's been insufficient, what one might call affordable housing being created by the public sector. But the broader point I would say is that it's actually a problem not so much of the supply of housing, but for the demand for housing. And my central argument is that the demand for housing has changed over time. Now, whereas in the post-war period, say up to the 1980s or 1990s, people viewed homes essentially as homes, places to live, places to bring up your children, a convenient place to get to work. There was a shift in the 80s, possibly a little later in Holland and continental Europe, into viewing housing as a financial asset, as well as a home. And when you view something as a financial asset, your approach to it changes. You start monitoring what happens to it, its price over time. You're prepared to invest more than you would if you're just using something as a consumption good that simply fills a simple purpose of, providing shelter. And the reasons for this change were, political, really. Governments made a decision in Anglo-Saxon economies like the UK, Australia, the US, most significantly, that people, as pressures mounted on the welfare state and the post-Keynesian sort of settlement, that people should have the right to own a home, and that home itself could help provide them with financial security and a source of equity finance that could enable a reduction in that in welfare payments and that post-war social settlement, a weakening of that post-war social settlement, essentially. Now, that was only possible with a deregulation and liberalization of mortgage finance. because without that, not enough people would have been able to afford to buy homes. So this idea of the sort of home owning democracy, this idea that everybody should have the right to privately own their own home with their own bit of land underneath it, that idea was made possible by financial liberalization, particularly, as I said, in the UK and the US. And what happened was banks essentially have turned into real estate lenders. Now, the textbook model of the bank is that it takes money from savers and lends it to businesses, entrepreneurs, for working capital or for capital investment, which are productive activities, are useful for the economy, supports economic growth. What we've actually had since the 1990s is a big shift in what banks do. Now, the majority of bank loans actually support the purchase of existing real estate assets, i.e. homes, properties, domestic residences. Now, I say existing because most mortgages do not finance the building of new homes, right? So they're not actually increasing the supply of new homes in the way I think a lot of people think maybe they do, and the way governments talk about mortgage finance. We need more mortgage finance to create more demand to build more homes. Actually, no. Actually, most mortgages simply increase the amount of money flowing into a relatively inelastic or finite supply of housing. Partially, that's also just to do with fundamentals. People want to live in cities near decent jobs, with near nice parks, near nice schools for their kids, with nice areas. And there's a fundamental limit on the amount of places in those areas. But there is this other problem that we've had this decline in affordable housing. And the state, as part of pulling back from that post-war welfare settlement, also pulled back on providing affordable subsidised land and affordable subsidised housing for a large swathe of the population. And social housing and social renting became rather stigmatised over time. And as a result, you just had a big growth in private renting and a decline actually in home ownership and in social housing. So, and the third aspect of this really is the taxation system has also favoured homeowners and property owners over renters and other types of tenure. So if you're a private owner of a home, you will not pay any capital gains tax on your house when you sell it. That applies, I think, in almost every single European country. Any other financial asset, when you sell it, if its value's gone up over time, you'll pay capital gains tax. There are various other subsidies as well, subsidies on not paying, offsetting your tax against your mortgage interest payments, inheritance tax breaks. So essentially, all the incentives are towards making the home a financial asset and the financialization of housing, rather than returning to the idea of homes being places to live, consumption goods.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you. So government regulations and asymmetry between renting and home ownership, as well as taxes, tax breaks for home ownership. These have led to the rise of prices of property over time. Now you could say that the 20th century was all about rising home ownership. And yet in the first 2 decades of this century, we've seen a decline in home ownership, while at the same time, the rents in cities go up. Now, arguably, more houses are owned by less people every year, so they become more concentrated in the hands of fewer people. Is home ownership becoming something of a marker of the well-off?
Yes, it is. Increasingly, I would say. What you're seeing is a decline in people, say, under the age of 35, being able to own homes. So there's 2 dimensions, really. There's a socioeconomic dimension. If you're poorer, you're less likely to be able to afford a deposit to get a home. And if you're younger, you're also less likely to benefit. The exception to that is people, as you said at the beginning, who are lucky enough to have a generous bank of mum and dad to be able to give them a large helping hand with their deposit. And of course, people with that kind of help tend to be better off in the first place. So the whole system that we have is reinforcing wealth inequalities rather than reducing them. And the more it goes on, the bigger those inequalities become, the more polarized our societies will become, and the more economically disenfranchised younger and poorer people will feel. And I don't think that's sustainable, frankly. I think we will have unrest eventually, and it could manifest itself in a variety of undesirable ways. So I think the best course of action is to try and change course earlier rather than later.
So how can we establish a level playing field for example, renting and home ownership? You mentioned there's a certain stigma revolving renting. Would you be more in favor of taxing home ownership, or, for example, to increase rights of tenants who want to rent?
I think you need to do both. You need to essentially make the housing taxation system tenure neutral. So there should be no advantage to you financially, whether you own your own home or whether you rent your own home. Or whether it's whether you're in a socially rented house owned by the government, or cooperatively owned house, or in a community land trust, or whatever the vehicle may be. That is absolutely key to the sustainability of the system. And I think as part of that, regulating the financial system so there's less mortgage credit flowing into this inelastic supply of housing is also really important, because the system itself is a bit like a positive feedback cycle. The more credit flows into housing, the higher house prices rise, the more the assets of the banks go up in value, the collateral value of the banks rises, the more confident they become about lending to people, the more people feel under pressure to get onto the housing market, get the first step on the housing ladder so they don't miss out on all of these wealth gains over time. And it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, really, that you end up in this situation of very high inequality, very high household debt as people take on bigger and bigger mortgages. And eventually you will, that will lead to a fall in consumption, because people will be paying more and more of their debt, more interest payments on their debt, and a financial crisis, as we saw in 2008, 2009.
Last question, Mr. Ryan Collins. If we continue on this course, do you think a collapse of the housing market is realistic within 5 years, for example?
Yes, I do think it's realistic. Whether it will be as severe as we had in 2008, hard to say. But if you look at the historical data, you tend to find you have these cycles, call them credit cycles. I would call them housing credit cycles. And you have these busts that happen about between every 15 to 20 years. And of course, in 5 years' time, we'll be due another one of those. It could be that the COVID pandemic speeds up that process, because you're going to have a collapse. You are having a collapse in people's incomes. So far, house prices have remained fairly stable, but I think that's partially because you've had sort of some strange things going on with people wanting to move out of cities and into places where they've got more space. And that's propped up demand a little bit outside of cities, perhaps. And also you've got rich people actually having more money than they would normally have, because they're not allowed to go out and spend it anywhere because of these lockdowns. So some funny things going on there, plus some governments stepped in to support the housing market, certainly in my country. But I think, maybe within 6 months, you'll probably see house prices start to fall as the reality of a sort of permanent loss in people's incomes hits home. And that will be a dangerous time. And we could see falls in house prices then, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ryan Collins. Looking forward to discussing this at length during our discussion part.
Thank you.
Yes.